Today I'm taking the opportunity to entertain a bit of fun, a bit of informed opinion, and a bit of theory by delving into the hypothetical continuity of Final Fantasy VIII. This isn't something I've done before, and hypotheticals and quote marks fan fiction beyond what we find in existent games isn't something I've ever really engaged with. However, following a recent suggestion about speculating on the events that followed Final Fantasy VIII, this idea really struck me, so I felt compelled to write it down and get it out of my system. And on this note, it's interesting to consider the sequels within the Final Fantasy universe, because I read several years ago that series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was inherently opposed to them during his tenure at Square, but when he started stepping down from duties prior to his resignation and the merger with Enix, we saw Square begin to produce extended universe material and sequels, beginning with Final Fantasy X and later 12 and 13, and infamously, of course, the Final Fantasy VII compilation. And I recall my friend saying at the time that he found it amusing they decided to start sequels with Final Fantasy X because he considered it one of the only games that didn't warrant a sequel. So here I'm going to entertain this idea of a Final Fantasy VIII-2, not so much to try and create a new and definitive story, but rather look at the loose ends, the established lore, history, geography and characters, without straying too far into new and hypothetical elements. Although, of course, with a sequel, there are naturally going to be some new elements and some new characters that will be necessary to propel the new story forwards. And there's plenty of room for crazy stuff to be explored in Final Fantasy VIII because, of course, it's one of the few that have hostile aliens raining down from the moon and things like this. But for my part, I largely want to pick up where the story left off and feel there's a wealth of characters who might emerge as major players in the events that follow. I feel there's stories consistent with the first game that can be told, and I believe there's a lot of existing issues that can also be resolved. And finally, before we jump in, as a purely creative, speculative discussion that I've only loosely considered, feel free to contribute suggestions, ideas, or how you might approach it differently in the comments, because there's plenty of potential and interpretation with Final Fantasy VIII. I'm going to post links in the description to all the existing elements of Final Fantasy VIII lore that I mention here, and where relevant I'll touch on comparative examples in real-world history, games, or other media to illustrate potential plot points or plot lines that I think work quite well. But beyond that, this is purely my assumption and opinion as an invested fan rather than someone with any experience of creative writing or scenario writing. So, looking at the closing moments of Final Fantasy VIII, we are presented with an idyllic series of vignettes wherein Laguna visits Rain's grave at Windhill with Ellone. Seifer smiles up at Garden overhead while fishing with Raijin and Fujin. And Squall, having been salvaged from time by Sorceress Rinoa, celebrates with friends and comrades aboard Garden. Now, despite appearances, these respective elements should be considered a brief respite rather than a happy ever after, and although the world is ostensibly saved from an evil sorceress and time compression, a myriad of issues still loom on the horizon, directly or indirectly affecting our heroes, two of which I think are interesting threads of unresolved story that offer the potential framework for a good Final Fantasy game, and the branching story arcs they are traditionally renowned, to have, that reconcile and conclude at a single point. The first thread is, after the first game, the question looms as to what happens to the Galbadian military in the wake of Deleng's murder and the demise of the sorceress. Who's there to pick up the pieces and assume control of the planet's greatest military power and lead this country's citizens in the ensuing power vacuum? It's an important consideration because many of the countries in the Western Peninsula of this game were either directly occupied or in open warfare with Galbadia in the events of the endgame. So this thread of story would form the backbone of the macro-political story, in my opinion, and the geopolitics maintain its precedence, much like in the first game, though with potentially different antagonists and aggressors, which I'll discuss shortly. The second thread of story worth exploring, in my opinion, is of course a personal micro-narrative. In this case, Squall and Rinoa. But actually, in this game, I think it could be much more focused on Rinoa and her status as a sorceress, because beyond the short reprieve of reconciling with her true love and romance Squall at the end of the last game, we are still existing in a world that is fearful and understandably opposed to the idea of a sorceress, in the wake of Adele, Adia, and Ultimisia. And this is something that Rinoa will have to contend with daily, undoubtedly feeling like a burden, despite her essential happiness with Squall and the safety of Balam Garden. And this would form the basis, or at least part of the basis, of the personal story arc that weaves throughout most Final Fantasies, eventually combining with the macro story for an epic conclusion and final act. There's also a few other situations that would inform the plot, such as dealing with the fallout of the Lunar Cry in the Esther region, the political question of whether Garden is relevant now that the sorceress is defeated, the origins of Ellone and junctioning, and various other intricacies I'll touch on later that could be addressed here. So let's begin the game and establish a context for the world we find ourselves in a year or so down the line from the conclusion of Final Fantasy VIII. And kicking off, I think two plausible scenarios could have occurred for Galbadia in the wake of the sorceress's defeat and then Zidling's murder. Scenario 1 is another leader has seized control of the nation in the confusion following time compression and the war, such as a hitherto unseen heir and son to President Deling, for example, which is possible, and it might work, but I personally feel this would make for a trite and repetitive storyline, because what we have here is another dictator mustering the Galbadian military again against the world, which is essentially what we had in the first game. The second plausible scenario, and much more interesting I think, is, much like in the wake of real world wars, a power vacuum is filled by allied powers who ease the aggressor country into a gradual demilitarization and pacifistic climb down through financial reparations and strategic occupation of its territories. We need only look at the end of World War I and the power share between Britain, France and America and the formation of the League of Nations to see how this scenario often plays out and how it can prove complicated due to vested interests and differing perspectives and demands, which makes for quite an interesting story, I think. For example, in keeping with World War I, we had the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, who was a skilled politician and ardent opponent to leniency with Germany. France had suffered catastrophic losses in terms of military, civilians and infrastructure over the course of the war, and Clemenceau's policy was to cripple Germany financially and annex much of the country into French territory, so that they could never again pose a threat to French interests. Between them was the slightly less harsh Britain, who had suffered comparatively less in the war, and also the much less harsh United States, whose President Woodrow Wilson was more concerned with winning an election back in America with the largely isolationist and disinterested citizens of that country. So naturally he didn't want to seem too involved in European affairs. Turning to the hypothetical Final Fantasy VIII-2, a diplomatic stalemate like this could prove an interesting and not an unlikely situation to find ourselves in a year after Ultimisia. It's not impossible that a united council of countries have formed to dictate the terms of a Galbadian peace process, and in this case we would have Esthar, represented by the fair and diplomatic-minded Laguna. We'd probably have Trebia, with a previously unseen leader. We'd have the newly reformed Republic of Timber, which had been a self-governing country prior to Galbadian invasion. We'd have Dole, represented by Duke Dole, possibly Fisherman's Horizon, represented by Mayor Dobe, and finally, of course, we'd have Galbadia at the table, logically represented by a candidate like General Caraway, because he's a leader of status and also an existing character. I'd also argue that, due to Balam Garden being integral to the defeat of both Galbadia and Ultimisia, they would have a seat at the table as an impartial party and mediator. And I think Squall's story arc into leadership in the first game now has to step up to another level into the new and complex and duplicitous world of global politics, where he's completely out of his depth once more. And this could see Laguna take him under his wing somewhat, offering nice dialogues and cutscenes about responsibilities to people and doing the right thing, etc., during the opening act. Now, of course, being a Final Fantasy game, this was never going to be a straightforward peace process, but rather than Galbadia proving the obvious aggressor, it would be a change of pace and much more interesting to see the true colours of otherworld leaders, which the first game didn't really explore. And in my opinion, there's several individuals that, like the situation after World War I, would like significantly more out of this bargain than what Galbadia is willing to give. And the most likely candidate for this, in my opinion, is the Duke of Dole. And this is for an important reason that's consistent with the setting and the lore of the first game. Now, taking a step back and returning to the lore within Final Fantasy VIII, we have the Ancient Centra, who were a race that thousands of years ago split and emigrated across the world to form two great empires. The first civilization they started was Dole, which went on to become the Great Dole Empire, and the other was at Esthar, which became technologically advanced. And I think this ancient heritage could prove a major part of the game, and in the case of the Duke, perhaps makes him quite a proud man with some direct ancestry with the Centra, because, of course, a Duke is a hereditary title. So perhaps the leadership of Dole does trace back to these ancient times. And he's intent on restoring his country's ancient name and seizing back the lands Galbadia had taken. And as such, he's driving a hard bargain with the council, whether out of contempt or out of a genuine wish and desperation to do well by his country remains to be seen. And we also have Trabia and Timber, who to some extent back him up, owing to their recent conflicts with Galbadia. Now, on the other side of the table, we have General Caraway, who really has great potential in this situation. The events of the first game showed him to be pragmatic, logical, and loyal to his country, almost to a fault. His commitment to Galbadia comes at the expense of his relationship with his daughter. It also shows him attempting to commit treason by hiring Seed to assassinate a deer, not because he covets power for himself, but because removing her is for the good of his country. So having Caraway around the negotiating table would prove an excellent set piece for the beginning of the game, because as a military man, he'd admit defeat and make some concessions after some reasonable discussions with Laguna, but he would never relent the integrity of his country to the impossible demands made by the leader of another country. So that creates an instant tension and animosity to launch the game events from. Furthermore, the secondary plot of Rinoa's status as a sorceress is also addressed here, because some of the council's concern, led by a character like the Duke of Dole again, is that sorceresses can't be trusted and are liable to throw the world into turmoil, whether it's Rinoa or one of her successors somewhere down the line. So he's advocating launching her into space again, or something like this, and her presence at the nearby Balam Garden is adding to the animosity and the tensions here. So the picture I'm painting is something like Final Fantasy Tactics or Game of Thrones. The council, situated somewhere like Deleng City, is extremely tense, and part of Squall's role in the process is having Balam Seed, along with forces from Trabia and other regions, policing the situation, trying to keep tensions of the populace down, and ensuring no conflict or uprising is attempted. I'm making the assumption here that Cid has relented his ownership of Garden, which he seemed to do in the first game, and he's retired to the orphanage with a deer, leaving Squall, Quistis and Zoo in charge of operations. And of all the Gardens present, Balam has the least representation, because they've been hired by Laguna to help restore Esthar following the Lunar Cry. So they're stationed over there, killing off monsters, helping citizens and refugees relocate using the Ragnarok, for example, because it's important to the beginning of this hypothetical story that Squall is outnumbered, prompting him and the player into direct action rather than delegating as a leader. Now, the presence of Rinoa at Balam is making this tense situation even worse, and Squall, perhaps at Laguna's recommendation, and as a result of some threatening comment made by the Duke about the sorceress's influence, sees fit to send Rinoa somewhere safe until the situation is resolved. And although Rinoa and Squall are in love, and Squall's previously said he'd become her knight and protect her, the stakes have changed, And as a leader in this global peace process, he understands his responsibility is to more than just himself, and she will be safer if they temporarily part ways. And this responsibility to the greater good is the backbone of his story arc and how he matures in this game. And where the first game saw him come to trust and rely on people, explored through his romance with Rinoa, the second game would show his emergence as a true leader, where his people and nations can turn and trust and rely on him. And in a way, he's sort of following in the footsteps of Laguna, keeping consistent with the theme of the first game. So, looking at the characters as we know them, this is exactly the sort of situation where Zell would volunteer to accompany Rinoa and say something like, "There's nowhere safer than my mother's house in Barlam. Nobody will look for her there." And probably Selphie tags along because that's the sort of character she is, but really you can choose your party at this point. But Squall would say, no, take her to the orphanage, well, she'll be safer with Cid and Adir. And this scenario allows the classic branching of gameplay that Final Fantasies generally did up until about Final Fantasy X. And now we see gameplay divided between Zell and co. and Rinoa's journey, and Squall, Irvine and Quistis, or whoever's left to deal with the soon-to-be dramatic events at Galbadia. And for Rinoa's part, the whole sorceress thing and being demonised by basically everyone is understandably wearing her down, and I think an important angle for her adventure would be recurring nightmares where she's harming those she loves or destroying the world and stuff like that, culminating in a desire to rid herself of her powers, which will soon become the basis of her journey, and will link up with the macro story later on, as I'll explain. So, after the Rinoa party leaves, the events at the capital come to a head when a midnight coup occurs, resulting in the murder of General Caraway, and many are quick to accuse Dole and Trebia because they have the most to gain from Caraway's removal. And I think Trebia is an important inclusion here because Dole is infamous for its small, incompetent army, but Trebia has a garden full of seed, many of which would desire revenge on Galbadia for its missile strike and the destruction of their garden. I also think the murder of Caraway is an important plot device for both macro-narrative and micro-narrative purposes. Regarding the former, he is a robust, formidable character, as the first game showed. The Galbadian people will have rallied behind him, and he would not have given an inch to the opposing nations. So, for Dole and Trebia to exert control, he would need to be removed. Regarding the personal narrative, Rinoa never reconciled with her father, and she was not present at his death, which gives a dramatic edge and a sense of loss to the situation when she later finds out. I also think some nice exchanges could have happened between Laguna, Squall and Caraway in the days before his death, because all three are pragmatic and logical men. They probably see eye to eye on world affairs, and maybe Caraway subtly asks how his daughter's doing and whether she got away safe, showing he cares, right before he dies, which is a classic tragic irony that Final Fantasies often employ. So, following the coup and Caraway's death, Squall and Laguna, who have comparatively smaller forces owing to Barlam Seed and Esthar busy, in Esthar ridding it of monsters, they're essentially left to their own devices in what is fast becoming a revolution on the streets of Deling, with accusations being thrown and Trebia and Dole clashing with Galbadian citizens, Galbadian forces, and Galbadian Seed. Squall and co are required to rescue several others, such as Mayadobe, Kiros Ward, Zoo, and a small group of Seed, and they kind of hole up somewhere. I feel that Barlam Garden should also get seized in this event, because for me, Barlam Garden as an environment is a place of comfort and safety and familiarity. So for Squall, it's his home, it's his childhood, and it's his school. And because his story arc in this game is about maturity, these events need to reflect life's unrelenting change, moving into responsibility and losing the past, which is forced upon us all as human beings. And this initial dilemma in his story arc is the loss of his home and the death of some of his seed, leading him to question his leadership skills and what he's doing. And he begins to wonder whether he was right to send Rinoa away, and he wonders how he's going to safeguard and re-establish order here. So, thus far in the story, we have Rinoa venturing south to the orphanage, suffering nightmares and visions that begin to convince her she should attempt to remove her powers, and we have Squall attempting to deal with a coup that has severely upset the prospect of world peace. At this juncture, we would ideally glimpse the antagonists to get some context as to their aims and intentions, and a short cutscene would indicate that, indeed, Duke Dole had a hand in this, but he's answering to a shady, mysterious figure who's somewhat orchestrating this situation, leading the Duke to believe that he can restore the integrity of his people. We also have the Trabia leader present, who is mistrustful of the Duke's weird supernatural advisor, but has bought into this plan because he wants to prevent Galbadia's restoration as well. He's a much more pragmatic military man, and warns the Duke that he can't obstruct talks or hold off Galbadia forever, and at this point the Duke reveals he has an ace up his sleeve, and the grand plan that will take the Final Fantasy VIII-2 story arc into its central act is revealed here. At this point I'm going to delve into slightly more of a hypothetical and new story element, but it is grounded in a potentially plausible history when looking at the established setting of Final Fantasy VIII. Now, there's 3 disparate bits of lore that inform much of the setting of the first Final Fantasy VIII that aren't explored thoroughly, but could be in this sequel. The first is the story of Great Hyne, a creator god who warred with humans and created the first sorceress, and later disappeared following his defeat. And not much is known about him other than the stories that are passed down, which we hear in NPC dialogue from the first game. The second is the ancient race of the Centra, who established the First Nations of Esthar and Dole, and these guys had at least some interaction and understanding of Hyne and the sorceresses, because on the first screen of the Centra ruins in Final Fantasy VIII, before we go up those sparkling steps, there is a statue of a sorceress and her knight, and the fact that the Centra have created a statue shows a knowledge and clearly some sort of reverence about these individuals. And the third and final bit of lore intrinsic to the world of Final Fantasy VIII is junctioning, which is the channeling of consciousness or abilities from one entity to another, which is currently available through Guardian Forces, Ellone, or Dr. Odine's junction machine Ellone in the distant future. Now, I mentioned earlier that Dole is one of 2 of the First Nations established by the Ancient Centra, and my narrative idea here is that Duke Dole is in a long line of ancestors from this ancient race, who has an heirloom of office that has been passed down through the centuries of the dukedom and the empire before that, all the way back to the Ancient Centra. And this mysterious new advisor over Dole's shoulder has revealed the significance of this item, and of course the player begins to understand at this point that the Duke is being puppeteered like Queen Brane or Gastau and so many foolish leaders in Final Fantasies before him, for some greater supernatural purpose that will be revealed later. So, what is significant about this heirloom of the Dole dukedom? Well, it relates to the true story of Great Hyne, which, in my hypothetical lore, is that he didn't disappear, as the legend says, but he was subdued by the Ancient Centra and trapped inside a crystal, much like the containment of GF Diablos, and this crystal was then broken up and distributed by the Ancient Centra to the far-flung corners of the world. This would account for the Centra splitting off to establish Dole in the west, Esthar in the east, and what became the Centra ruins in the south, each containing their own remnant of Hyne. And the story of his disappearance was passed down through the generations to prevent people from looking for him and restoring this powerful entity to the worlds of men. Now, in subduing Hyne, some of his power was transferred to the person closest to him, much like Voldemort passing part of himself into Harry Potter's Scar, and thus we have the first sorceress. And the one who subdued him was a remarkable individual capable of forcing, or should we say junctioning, his consciousness into the crystal. And this is the ancient ancestor of Ellone. And now, with Hyne's consciousness transplanted into the crystal, all that's left behind is a husk of this deity, which ties in with the inaccurate fairy tale told by NPCs that Hyne left his useless body half behind, which was discarded for humanity. So my idea here is that much of the game is going to revolve around the three remnants of Hyne, and our party attempting to stop this restoration of Hyne from happening. Duke Dole foolishly believes that holding all the remnants will restore his empire, but he's merely being manoeuvred by the mysterious advisor behind him. Rinoa, through dreams and visions, also comes to believe that unmaking a sorceress can only be achieved by returning to the entity in the situation from which the sorceress was first made. And again, I think the entity that is manipulating Dole also has access to Rinoa's thoughts, subconsciously nudging her towards this idea. And this is where the macro and micro narratives will eventually join up, and we'll find out what this entity is and how it's managing to do this. So, returning to the game, we've had a short cutscene introducing Dole's plan, Trabia's alliance, and the mystery advisor, who I'll discuss in detail shortly. So now let's cut back to Rinoa, who, after some gameplay, arrives at the orphanage. We meet Cid and Adir, and there's a reunion and some dialogue, and Cid mentions that she's not the only stranger who's shown up lately, and there's someone down at the beach. So Rinoa heads down to the beach, leaving the others to catch up, and who should be there, staring out across the ocean, much like how we left him in the ending of the first game, but Seifer. Now, Seifer is a controversial character who many dislike and others love. For my part, I think he's fantastic because he's very flawed and he's very human, and his poor decisions in the first game make him ripe for a redemption arc in the second game. The last time we saw him, he was fishing with Raijin and Fujin at Balam Harbour, but much like the other characters in the ending, this was only a brief respite from reality, which, in Seifer's case, is having to confront the betrayal and treason he perpetrated in pursuit of his naive dream. And my hypothetical story here is that Seifer can't confront his guilt and his past with Raijin and Fujin around, and obviously he can't return to Garden with them because he's ostracised for his actions. So he's urged them to return to complete their education and help resolve the situation in Esthar or something like that. And he in turn has travelled aimlessly and alone in this personal purgatory, trying to figure himself out and winding back up at his childhood home, the orphanage. So a day passes, maybe some menial quests happen, Zell and Selphie have some sarcastic exchanges with Seifer, and Rinoa is starting to have visions of this Hyne remnant and the nearby Centra ruins, which are kind of intensifying in her dreams and visions. As such, she has resolved to sneak off in the night to begin her pilgrimage to remove the sorceress's curse, which she is being drawn towards the Centra ruins, and what we will later find out is the Hyne remnant. However, when attempting to sneak off, Seifer is awake and waiting to confront her. They have a touching conversation. He tells her he knows how it feels to be an outcast, how it is to feel alone even when you're with your friends around you, etc. And when he can't convince her to stay, he resolves to accompany her to find the remnant, inadvertently fulfilling his original dream of being a sorceress's knight without even realising it. The next day, Zell and Selphie receive word that the talks in the capital have gone south and General Caraway has been murdered. They also discover that Rinoa is missing, and after a brief debate about what they should do, they opt to chase after Rinoa, and so begins another branch of gameplay with its own side quests as they set out to find her. Seifer and Rinoa arrive at Centra to find a contingent of Dole forces excavating the site in search for the remnant. And they take them out, they find the remnant whose presence was responsible for those shimmering staircases we saw in the first game, which resolves that very important plotline. And Rinoa has a vision when coming into contact with the remnant that everything comes together in the mountains of northern Esthar. Returning to Squall's story, the tables have turned and Trabia and Dole have largely contained the city and the world leaders, allowing them to enact Phase 2 of their plan, which relies on them receiving these remnants. Word arrives, thanks to the restored communications towers in the previous game, that Sorceress Rinoa got there first and has seized the Centra remnant. So the Duke and his mystery advisor leave by airship to seize it back from them personally. Squall and co hatch a plan to storm the council chambers to apprehend these rebellious leaders. Laguna wishes them luck, and Zu and the remaining Seed stick around to guard the remaining leaders and do reconnaissance around Ellone to see if they can get back into Balamb Garden. Squall forms his party, storms the council chambers, has a obligatory boss fight with Trebia, and this is where Trebia reveals Dole and the Shadowy Man, along with several scout forces, have gone after Rinoa, and they'll probably be intercepted on the way to northern Esthar. And at this point, the Remnant of Hyne plot is revealed to Squall and Co. So now everyone's aware the Remnant of Hyne is a thing. Now, another benefit of Balamb Garden being seized and the Ragnarok being used overseas is we have the adventure beginning on foot and by train for Squall, like all good Final Fantasy games. And naturally, he rushes to save Rinoa, which is a route that would see him venture through timber across the ridiculously big bridge to Fisherman's Horizon, and eventually to the Great Salt Sea, leading to Esthar, which is a great opportunity for gameplay, side quests. Maybe we'll bump into Zone and Watts and some other legacy characters along the way for some micro-narratives and exposition. And I'd particularly like to bump into Biggs and Wedge to see what they're up to these days, because they are just ridiculous characters. So, cutting back to Rinoa and Seifer, they are inching their way up this central archipelago, and they're intent on finding passage over to the eastern continent. And while travelling through some mountain pass or woodland, they are ambushed by Dole and Trebia forces, and the enemies reveal that they found them, which instantly reveals to Rinoa that they're being hunted down for the Remnant. And just as the enemies are gloating about how Rinoa and Seifer are ridiculously outnumbered, Zell and Selphie catch up to them in an act of Deus Ex Machina, and the party unifies to do a series of battles and a boss fight, for example. After this scenario, they have the obligatory catch-up to download information to one another. Rinoa discusses the Remnant, and Zell reveals that General Caraway is dead. So there's this sad moment, and Seifer gets angry and vows revenge, and it's concluded that if it's the Remnant that Dole is after, then they are probably heading to the mountains of northern Esthar. So they recover the enemy transports, and they make their way across the sea to the eastern continent, stating that the city of Esthar isn't too far away. Cutting back to Squall, he's making his way across this bridge and towards the Great Salt Sea. At this point, he comes across some enemy scouts and brazenly attempts to apprehend them to find out where Rinoa is. In this instance, Squall and the party are overwhelmed and imprisoned, which will initiate an escape sequence the next time we come to him. And there'll be some, lengthy dialogue and action and quests to kind of flesh this Squall scenario out, because I haven't figured it out yet. But then we cut back to Rinoa, and this party get to Esthar first, finding it in a state of rebuilding. And here we have a catch-up with some legacy characters such as Nida, Reijin, Fujin, and others. And these two are overjoyed to see Seifer again, who confidently states that he's on a mission to finally do something good. And naturally, the party can run around and do side quests and, explore Esthar at this stage, before leaving north to find the Remnant in the mountains between Trebia and Esthar. Going back to Squall, he and the party managed to escape, and after a bit of a grind managed to make their way to Esthar. And similarly, there is a catch-up, and Nida tells Squall Rinoa and co passed through recently, and Squall is bewildered to hear that Seifer is with them. We also learned that the Ragnarok is out of action due to a monster attack or something like this, and a series of fetch quests will get it up and running again, allowing Squall and co to catch up with Rinoa in time. Returning to the Rinoa party, they've made their way to the mountains, and her visions are intensifying about the nearby Remnant. As we make our way through, the Duke, his mysterious advisor, and a small force of soldiers arrive to apprehend them. The party manage to defeat the soldiers, but at this point the shadowy advisor reveals his grand plan, and that the party have helped him get this far, and even with only 1/3 of his power, he'll be more than a match for them. At this point, the advisor kills the Duke and seizes his crystal, assimilating it into himself and going weirdly superhuman, as bosses often do. And this is where we get a big reveal and some questions answered. So, who is this mysterious advisor? Why does he have access to Rinoa's thoughts? And why does he want the remnants to be restored? Well, You might have guessed already, but this entity is the bodily husk of Hyne that was left behind after his powers were trapped in the crystal and he was defeated thousands of years ago. He has access to Rinoa because part of him is Rinoa, which is the sorceress's power, and he's manipulating the Duke because he is in possession of the remnant that is integral to Hyne's restoration. So the next question is, how has he returned, and why now? And there's a few reasons that could account for this. Firstly, maybe he's always been around, fumbling and weak, but immortal, because even though half of him is discarded, he is still, half god. And maybe he's simply been biding his time, trying to maneuver his way into power. Or perhaps the second more convincing reason is that in the wake of time compression from the previous game, this malignant but feeble husk of a god from thousands of years ago has managed to use this opportunity to enter the present, and using the Duke and his influence to do what he is not currently strong enough to do, which is reuniting the remnants and return for good. So there is our reveal, and the shadowy advisor revealed to be Hyne now has 1/3 of his strength back, thanks to the Duke's remnant. At this point, Seifer tells the rest of the party to run and get to the other remnant to take it away or destroy it, and he bars the path, not allowing Hyne to proceed. And this is where the redemption arc comes to its symbolic fruition, because this location in northern Esthar, the Vienne mountains, is the same location where Laguna starred as a sorceress's knight in a movie all those years ago, which was the movie that inspired Seifer's dream to be a knight in the first place. And at this point, although I really like the character of Seifer, and much like Boromir in Lord of the Rings and so many redemption arcs besides this, the poetic conclusion could be for Seifer to get killed, defending Rinoa's escape from Hyne, and in doing this, he's finally redeeming himself, finally fulfilling his dream, and finally proving himself the right sorceress's knight for the right sorceress. Shortly afterwards, the Ragnarok arrives. Squall finds Seifer. Maybe he's dead, maybe he's clinging on just long enough to have some reconciliation with Squall and co. Maybe Regin and Fujin are there because they tagged along to find their friend. And it's an emotional moment, but afterwards, Squall and the party venture into the mountains, into some caves to find Rinoa and the second party waking from unconsciousness, to find that Hyne has taken the second remnant and has moved through the mountain to find the third and final one. At this point, the party concludes two things. Firstly, Hyne cannot fully restore himself without taking back the power embodied by Rinoa. And secondly, they need Ellone to help contain him like her ancient ancestor did, giving them the opportunity to destroy Hyne for good. Squall and Rinoa have a romantic reconciliation, much like the moment in the fields in the first game. And at this point we have the free roaming ability and Ragnarok access that permits the entire party to fly around, and the player can have fun, do side quests, visit all the locations, ultimately with the intention to find Ellone. The party returns to Galbadia, where Laguna and co have managed to ease the tensions now that Trebia and Dole are gone, and peace negotiations have recommenced. Laguna tells us Ellone always talked about returning to Windhill with the White Seed, and upon going there, we find that she's helping set up a new garden for the White Seed, who need a permanent home now that they're no longer on the run. So, much like Sephiroth's force field around the northern continent in Final Fantasy VII, in this situation, Hyne could have created a force field around the mountains, and it's up to the player to enter this and initiate the endgame. Once this is entered, we come to the obligatory crazy boss, who shifts and morphs into 2 or 3 adaptations. And the complexity to completely destroy Hyne, as the characters will have discussed by this point, is that he needs to be drawing the sorceress element out of Rinoa so that every facet of him is complete. And it's in this small moment that we need to, take advantage and kill him. So after successfully doing the boss fight, midway through this transfer, Ellone splits his consciousness and Squall and the others act, and he's destroyed for good, ending the line of sorceresses in the process, so Rinoa is no longer a sorceress, and bringing the final boss, element of Final Fantasy VIII-2 to its end. The ending sees the party reconciled, and Rinoa is no longer a sorceress, as I've said. They return to Galbadia to a funeral procession for the late General Caraway, which marks the realisation and the need for peace between all of these nations. And if indeed Seifer does die, as I'm not 100% on that yet, we also give him a send-off appropriate for a hero. Perhaps near the orphanage with Adir and Cid and everyone from Garden in attendance. Squall and Rinoa return to negotiations with Laguna, Kiros and Ward, among all of the other leaders. And right at the very end, Laguna turns to them and hints that Galbadia is in need of a new, decent leader. So that about wraps up my initial thought process following the ending of the first game. Once again, I've only really made a story off the back of existing lore and setting, and only in a very loose way, without looking closely at themes and story arcs and secondary characters, and how these smaller narratives might branch out and flesh the game out. For example, do we cut back to Laguna periodically to manage the situation in the capital? And what obstacles does Squall and Co encounter on all of their journeys? And frankly, beyond the ideas that I've presented here, there's hundreds of potential directions you could take the story of Final Fantasy VIII down. I've heard it suggested that a Laguna prequel game would be awesome. I've also heard some suggest that the Lunar Cry and the space element is what interests them most to be explored. And a friend of mine even suggested that a game focusing on the adventures of Biggs and Wedge once they leave the military would be hilarious. So, what are your thoughts? What kind of Final Fantasy VIII sequel would you like to see? Drop a comment, start a conversation. And as always, if you like my content, please share and subscribe to help my channel grow.